19th century, same-sex friends could be more affectionate with each other than they often can today, making pledges of undying love and devotion, and even indulging in physical intimacy to some extent. Men formed close, often ambiguous relationships with other men, women with other women. They inhabited a space between friends and lovers, long before terms like gay or bisexual existed. These relationships came to be called romantic friendships.
Such relationships defined the life of Charles Sumner. Sumner represented Massachusetts for a quarter century in the United States Senate. He was an abolitionist and a fierce advocate for the equality of all people before the law. In 1837, when he was 26 years old, Sumner forged two of the most important friendships he ever had. He formed one of these friendships with Samuel Gridley Howe, a doctor and abolitionist who revolutionized the education of blind people.
These two men first met in the middle of a riot, of all places. They remained apart for several years, as Sumner traveled in Europe. When he returned to the United States, they met again, and became deeply attached to one another. By 1841, Sumner tended to spend his Saturdays with Howe. They even visited each other during the workday, distracting Sumner from his work and catching the attention and annoyance of his law partner, George Hillard.
He's quite in love with Howe, and spends so much time with him, I begin to feel the shooting pains of jealousy.
I am with Howe a great deal. Bachelors both, we ride and drive together and pass our evenings far into the watches of the night in free and warm communion. I think, however, he will be married very soon. What then will become of me? It is a dreary world to travel in alone.
Sumner had good reason to be afraid. Societal expectations dictated that men in romantic friendships should distance themselves, emotionally and physically, from their male companions when they married. Close relationships between men were acceptable, even desirable, until they could be superseded by a marriage to a woman. Sam Howe seemed to agree with this view.
I find my heart yearning more and more for something to love, even more than I love you, my dear Sumner. But till I find it, let me be all yours.
Sumner's fears came true in 1843, when both Sam Howe and his other closest friend, Henry Longfellow, became engaged. Fearing a lifetime of loneliness, Sumner tumbled into a deep depression. Howe tried to help in his own brash, tough way, which actually lifted Sumner's spirits somewhat.
Go on. Neglect exercise, neglect sleep, study late and early, stoop over your table, work yourself to death, grieve all your friends, and break my heart. For where, dear Charlie, at my time of life, shall I find a friend to love as I love you?
I have had 2 warm love letters from Howe. He is as earnest a lover as philanthropist.
Howe tried to commit to both Sumner and his wife, but he somehow managed to work out an arrangement that functioned at the expense of both of them.
Sam had just married Julia Ward Howe, who later became famous in her own right as an activist and as the lyricist of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. The Howes had a tumultuous marriage, to say the least, and trouble arose even during the honeymoon. Sam Howe wrote 40 letters over the course of their trip through Europe. He wrote 7 of these letters to a variety of recipients. To Charles Sumner, he wrote the other 33. The frequency and fervor of Sam's letters led Julia to complain that
Sumner ought to have been a woman, and you to have married her.
In the early days of the honeymoon, Sam Howe seemed exuberant about his marriage to Julia Ward, but he had a harder time extricating himself from his romantic friendship with Charles Sumner than he predicted. He had hoped that marrying a woman would provide him with a greater love than his love for a man, but reality proved to be much more complicated. This emotional conflict, pulling Sam Howe back and forth between Julia and Charles, often appears in his letters to Sumner from this period.
Were you here now? Your straps unbuttoned, your waistband also, your feet in my red slippers, a glass of Orvieto in your hand, your sweet smile on your lips, just as you used to sit in my easy chair of a Saturday night. Then I would tell you how delightful it is to be married. Then would I discourse to you of the deep, strong tenderness of a high woman, of a woman like my Julia.
Suffice to say, Sam Howe never succeeded in striking a workable balance or making everyone happy. As the years wore on, Julia Ward Howe abandoned all hope of making her marriage work. She knew that she and her husband did not love each other.
I do not see why one should pretend to be happy when one is not, or why one should try to say to oneself, I love this man, when love is a matter out of the question.
Julia Ward Howe poured the frustrations of her personal life into her writing career. Around 1846 or 1847, she began a novel today known as The Hermaphrodite, which she never completed or published. The story centered around a character named Lawrence, who would be called intersex today, and who pursued romantic attachments with both men and women. Professor Emeritus Gary Williams theorizes that the novel may have been Howe's way of trying to understand queerness and the complex relationship between herself, her husband, and Charles Sumner.
This complex relationship persisted until political differences drove a wedge between Sam Howe and Charles Sumner in the early 1870s. The two men never reconciled before Sumner's death in 1874, to Howe's great regret.
Studying this romantic friendship today comes with many challenges. Sumner heavily censored the letters he received from Howe, apparently in places where they became dangerously intimate. Sometimes entire letters from Howe are missing. The sheets we do have feature large sections sliced out with razor blades or blotted out with ink. Despite the fact that romantic friendships were acceptable in their society, they still needed to hide transgressive aspects of this complex relationship.
As for the letters Sumner wrote to Howe, the vast majority no longer exist. Though the two men shared a deep attachment for over 30 years, only 14 letters from Sumner to Howe still exist today. Howe's family destroyed potentially damning swaths of his correspondence after his death, and other letters even met a similar fate during his lifetime.
I have made a rule lately to put in the only safe place such notes of yours as might be disagreeable to you to have seen by unfriendly eyes on the grate. It cost me something to burn a piece of paper that has been hollowed to my eye by the impress of your hand, but I do it. I have no confidant for such things. No, not one.
The boundary between romantic friendships and romantic love was not always clear at the time, nor is it clear when we read about these situations now. What is clear to us today is that Sumner and the Howes struggled to make the distinction, hurting each other along the way.
Charles Sumner's relationship with the Howes could often be uncomfortable, but many romantic friendships unfolded in other ways. Charles Sumner's relationship with Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, for example, took a very different course.
Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was a professor of modern languages at Harvard and, eventually, a world-famous poet. Sumner and Longfellow also met in 1837 at a dinner with a mutual friend, Cornelius Felton. The two became inseparable almost immediately.
Despite Sumner traveling to Europe a few months after their initial meeting, the friendship continued to prosper. They became devoted correspondents and shared everything with one another. Snapshots of daily life, gossip about friends, and their deepest thoughts and feelings.
Henry Longfellow, in particular, had a lot of feelings to share. In 1836, while traveling through Europe himself, Longfellow had met and fallen in love with a young heiress named Fanny Appleton. In December 1837, only a few weeks after Sumner sailed away, Longfellow proposed, and she immediately rejected him. Devastated, he shared his sorrows with his best friend.
I am lonely. When you come back with your great soul brimful of wondrous impressions, my soul will rejoice at your coming and go out to meet you. They who have read the same book understand each other better. You will reassure me of the reality of many things which are growing unreal in my imagination.
Sumner, who found himself in the uncomfortable position of being friends with both, grew increasingly protective of Longfellow, writing,
I cannot bear to see you keep your heart so long in suspense, not to say more than that. I say, then win her or abandon her. I am as much surprised that she fails to love as that you continue to love.
Upon Sumner's return from Europe, the two rarely parted. Sumner spent every Sunday with Longfellow, and the two pursued every excuse to meet up during the week. Even so, trouble still brewed. Longfellow remained hopelessly in love with Fanny Appleton, despite his intimacy with Sumner, and in May of 1843 he finally won her heart. A day after their engagement, Sumner wrote him,
I fear much, dear Henry, that I may have seemed dull and indifferent to your great happiness when you first broke it to me this morning. If such a thought passed your mind, do not let it stay. I rejoice in your great joy. You have deserved it all. Fanny has done right. You loved her first. Besides, you are far worthier than all others. What shall I do these long summer evenings, and what will become of those Sabbaths sacred to friendship and repose?
Reeling from the loss of Howe, and now inconsolable at the prospect of losing Henry Longfellow as well, he privately confided to a friend,
I am alone. Alone. My friends fall away from me.
Fanny Appleton stepped in to prove Sumner wrong. After the engagement, Henry Longfellow constantly reassured Sumner that he would still be a part of their lives, needing his friend just as much as Sumner needed him. Fanny Appleton took a more direct approach, clearly sensing that words alone could not convince him. She asked Sumner to chaperone her dates with Henry, and actively ensured that they always included Sumner as a member of the family. Realizing he might not be left behind after all, Sumner wrote to Appleton,
I met Franklin Dexter last evening, who said, So your friend is engaged at last. I replied simply, My friends.
On August 7th, 1843, Sumner received a surprising letter from her, inviting him to be a guest on their honeymoon.
We shall return to Boston tomorrow morning to leave in the afternoon cars for Springfield, and both earnestly hope you will be able and willing to accompany us. Henry promises to appear at the office by 11 o'clock and hopes to find you with your trunk packed.
Sumner accepted the offer, adding himself to a party that also included Fanny's best friends, Emmeline Austen, among others. When the honeymoon ended, Sumner once again faced an uncertain and potentially lonely future.
Returned last evening from a bridal tour with Longfellow and his wife. You will find dear Longfellow married to one who is beautiful and most lovely. As for me, I'm very much alone and altogether a poor creature.
Fanny Longfellow kept fighting to include Sumner. When she and her husband returned from the trip, she invited Sumner to the first dinner in their new home. She sat him at the head of the table, cementing once and for all his place in their home and in their lives. Though Sumner became a bit of a third wheel, the prior intimacy he had with Henry Longfellow remained intact. He and Fanny Longfellow had simply grown just as close. When the state legislature elected Sumner to the Senate and he needed to move to Washington, his absence left a void in Henry and Fanny Longfellow's lives.
Your farewell note came safe and sad, and on Sunday no well-known footstep in the hall or sound of cane laid upon the table. We ate our dinner somewhat silently by ourselves, and talked of you far off, looking at your empty chair, your vacant place.
Much like Howe, throughout their years of friendship, both Henry and Fanny Longfellow encouraged Sumner to marry, with Fanny especially active in the hunt to find him a wife. He did not usually mind her assistance in meddling. Despite his strong attachments to Howe and Longfellow, he wished to marry and start a family of his own, at least theoretically. He even briefly attempted a courtship with Julia Ward Howe's sister, Louisa. The attempt failed on multiple levels. Frustrated, Fanny wrote,
Seriously, dear Charles, I grieve to hear you say your life is weary, and pray as earnestly as ever for your happiness. More earnestly, I may say, since I know what happiness is, and therefore long to have you make room in your heart for someone worth of so holy a temple. But I must not entrust this advice to the wings of a letter. When we are by the cozy fireside of Castle Craigie, you shall hear how eloquent I can be on the subject.
Perhaps hoping to avoid the lecture, he responded,
I am not wrong in letting her escape, even if I could hope, as I have no reason to hope that I could detain her. Sincerely, I have no desire in that quarter, nor in any other.
Sumner and Fanny Longfellow mentioned other women in their correspondence: Elizabeth Austen, Emmeline MacLeod, and even the journalist and poet Matilda Hayes. Hayes, especially, would not have been a good match for Sumner. She was already in a relationship with the Shakespearean actress Charlotte Cushman.
In 1861, Fanny Longfellow tragically passed away in a fire, and the two men, who both clearly loved her in their own ways, found solace in one another.
Daily, hourly, constantly, I think of you, and my thoughts end with myself. For I cannot forget my own great and irreparable loss. In all visions for life, I have always included her. For it never occurred to me that I should be the survivor, and I counted upon her friendship to the last. How strong must be your grief, I know and feel in my heart. But your happiness has been great, and the memories which remain are precious. I long to talk with you, and to enter into all this experience so trying, and to help you to bear it, if I can.
In 1866, Charles Sumner finally married, attaching himself to a young socialite named Alice Hooper, who had helped nurse him back to health after a debilitating illness. The relationship deteriorated almost immediately. Incompatible personalities and tempers put them at constant odds, and it became clear that neither could give the other what they needed. Alice Sumner was young and energetic, eager to party and make friends. Sumner was overworked, physically and mentally exhausted, and eager for a quiet family life. She soon started lashing out at him, sometimes violently, and he responded by pulling away.
I never entered the carriage with her to drive to dinner that she did not treat me so that I was obliged to find relief in tears.
Desperate for the companionship her husband could not provide, Alice Sumner formed a romantic friendship of her own with a Prussian diplomat. Despite evidence to suggest the friendship remained fully platonic, rumors of an affair circulated throughout Washington society, as well as rumors of Sumner's impotence. With so much damage done, Charles and Alice Sumner eventually divorced, and never spoke to one another again.
The loss of Fanny Longfellow, the Civil War, and Sumner's failed marriage were only some of the painful trials both men endured. Through it all, Charles Sumner and Henry Longfellow's love and support for each other remained constant.
Do not be disheartened. You have much work of the noble kind to do yet. Let us die standing.
When Sumner died in 1874, Longfellow led the efforts to preserve his legacy, becoming the executor of his estate, and urging correspondents to send him Sumner's letters. Samuel Gridley Howe provided the scant handful of letters that he deemed acceptable. The bonds of romantic friendship between Longfellow and Sumner remained a constant in their lives, despite Sumner's fears of solitude. For 37 years, the steady love and affection the two shared stood in stark contrast to the volatile relationship between Sumner and Howe. That contrast speaks to the wide range of possible relationships that the phrase romantic friendships represents.
Have you balanced different kinds of relationships in your life? Have you ever felt torn between two people?